Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Recovery Talk. So, today we are going to talk about rewiring and the importance of repeated exposure, or to put it into plain English, why you have to do the things that scare you over and over until they no longer scare you anymore. I would actually go as far as saying, as for a full recovery, this is an absolute essential. And I think my issue sometimes with some of the traditional treatment of eating disorders is that it treats exposure therapy, so doing the things that scare you, having the fear foods, putting yourself into those situations you're uncomfortable with, as if it was an optional add-on. And don't get me wrong, I do believe in a food first approach. When someone is undernourished, potentially underweight, yes, of course, you're going to focus on nutritional rehabilitation. So refeeding, restoring weight. And there is a point where you're just going to have to focus on staying alive. So if you're listening to this and maybe you are at an inpatient setting where it's a very strict meal plan, a very strict focus on getting your weight up, I don't want you to listen to this and then panic and be like, oh my God, I'm doing recovery the wrong way. This is not going to work. There is a time and place for everything. That being said, I do think that implementing challenges, implementing more rewiring work and challenging yourself with foods and situations can also have a place earlier in recovery. I just understand that for some people, it's just logistically a little bit more tricky if they're not as in control of their own recovery. For example, there are inpatients. So I just want to make that clear because I do not want someone to not comply with potentially life-saving treatment because they feel like it's not ideal or perfect. Save your life first, okay? And remember, no recovery is far, far worse than what a so-called imperfect recovery ever could be. Just mentioning this because I know that some people have a recovery perfectionism mindset that actually tilts in the direction of, if I can't do it perfectly at any stage, I'm not going to do it. That's not helpful. That is your eating disorder taking advantage of recovery, trying to use it against you to continue the eating disorder itself. So I always see recovery as almost a bit of a chair with 4 legs, and you have to focus on each leg or the chair is going to be really wobbly. And of course, a wobbly chair is better than no chair, but why not just get a solid chair that you can sit on, that you want to sit on, that you can continue sitting on for many decades to come? And these 4 legs are what I call the 4 R's. So you have rest, which relates to, yes, getting enough physical rest, but also your relationship with movement overall. And then you have refeeding, which refers to kind of self-explanatory food, getting in enough food, eating regular, consistent, and enough. And we have restoration, which, yes, means weight restoration, but also just the general restoration of your physical health beyond weight as well. And last but not least, we have what I'm going to talk about today, which is rewiring, or I sometimes call it reprogramming. And that is the mental part, challenging yourself, breaking old habits, challenging the ingrained limiting eating disorder beliefs, and really addressing all of those sneaky little things that you're doing that you probably aren't even always aware that you're doing that reinforce the eating disorder. Just a quick side note, I've made an episode about the 4 R's in the past, titled The 4 R's of Recovery. So if you're feeling a little bit confused about what I'm talking about with these chair legs, then check that out. So what is rewiring? Why is it so essential? Rewiring is the process of teaching your brain new patterns and behaviors around food, around eating, around movement, around body image. Essentially, you want to show your brain and body that recovery and being recovered is safe. Because right now what's going on is that your brain sees that as a threat. In a previous episode titled OCD and Eating Disorders, I talk about how in some ways an eating disorder is very similar to OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, because there is a core fear, and then there are all of these obsessions and compulsions and ruminations around this. all sorts of safety behavior to alleviate anxiety. And yeah, that may work in the moment, but long term, it makes it a lot worse. So for OCD and for anxiety disorders, more like phobia-related anxiety disorders especially, the gold standard treatment is exposure therapy. So gradually putting yourself in challenging situations to show your brain that it is safe. And for eating disorder recovery, that is equally important. In an eating disorder, what you've actually done is you have conditioned or trained your brain to see certain things as a threat and to have a very overactive threat monitor where certain things that for most people wouldn't necessarily be seen as a threat or be considered very scary or abnormal or pathological, your brain just fires off these signals that something bad is happening, that you're in danger. But your brain is actually just trying to do its job. It's trying to keep you safe. It has just gotten the wrong memo of what is actually dangerous to you. So it's trying to keep you safe by making you tempted to engage in a set of behaviors that are actually very dangerous. Eating disorders are not just harmless little conditions, they're potentially life-threatening. And I actually find that this approach of, hey, your brain is trying to protect you, but it's gotten the wrong memo, find that to be a lot more compassionate and also can be quite helpful if there is a lot of resistance. And also if you're feeling silly about your eating disorder, I mean, phobias. I actually got a book the other day, which is literally just the whole book is a list of specific phobias that people have. So if you ever feel like silly for having an eating disorder, silly for having these fears, like if something exists, there is a phobia for it. Trust me. Our brain can pick up the most random things and make it a phobia. Oftentimes it's just random wires that get crossed. And now keep in mind that we do live in diet culture. We do live in a society that often reinforce these fears. So it's not actually completely illogical that some people develop eating disorders. So when you're afraid of something, the default reaction is avoidance. And if you can't avoid, you may develop a set of safety behaviors that you do to alleviate the fear, or maybe to make that worst case scenario less likely to happen, or you believe it will make it less likely to happen. So for example, you may have an intense fear of weight gain. So as a result, you start restricting your food. You may be engaging in purging behaviors, especially after a binge. Or you may be engaging in some form of compensatory behavior in terms of movement. You may behave in monitoring behaviors around your body, so body checking behaviors. And what memo does the brain get? Well, it realizes that, wow, yeah, weight gain must be really scary because my person is doing all of these things to avoid it. So yeah, let's keep the threat detection on for this one. So the more you're engaging in behaviors that aligns with the eating disorder and alleviate some of that anxiety, the scarier it gets to do the opposite action. And then rewiring, of course, means doing the opposite action. And some people do that in more of an all-in approach, whilst other people work on gradually challenging. Essentially, you want to show your brain that it's no longer scary by doing it. And ideally, you want to give your brain some good experiences as well. All-in is more of an extreme version of exposure therapy, which can work really well for some people. I've discussed this more in the episode I did on all-in, that's just titled all-in. But other people may find that it's just a bit too much, a bit too soon. And that starting with a slightly easier challenge and then kind of working their way up can be a better way. I've said it before and I said it again, different strokes for different folks. I work with either method. I'm not like weirdly attached to one way of doing recovery for every single person. I think it's so strange when people do that. Everyone is different. And also, I have to let my clients decide a little bit as well. I'm not there to like tell them how to do recovery. I'm there to guide them, finding a way that works for them. And that's a similar thing we see in just general exposure therapy as well. Sometimes someone may do a very big challenge. Other times they do a small one. Sometimes they feel they just have to throw themselves straight into it, whilst other people want to build up a bit gradually. Those two people can still end up at the same end point, the same destination eventually, but their journeys there may be different. And I actually think consistency is more important than having to do it as quickly and brutally as possible. Because sometimes people may do a massive challenge and it's just so scary. Went from like a 0 to 100 on the difficulty level, and they're so overwhelmed and so panicked. And then they're like, whoa, this is not for me anymore. There's no way I can keep doing this every single day for months on end. And if so, it's okay to maybe go a bit more step by step. But what is important is that the difficulty level increases. Because there is also some people who are like, well, I did a challenge. And it's like, yeah, but what was challenging 2 months ago should be less challenging by now. And I would say this is at the core of how I work with clients when it comes to goal setting. It's essentially coaching one-on-one. We set a specific goal. You complete the goal, hopefully. If not, at least we can look back, learn from it, see what we can do differently the coming week. And then we add on to the difficulty level. Some weeks we may add on a lot to the difficulty level. Maybe you're having a week where you feel really ready to push through, to really go for it. And then other weeks, it may be a bit more like a slow progression. And yeah, there may even be times when you have a bad week, times where the goal didn't go off to plan. That doesn't mean you ruined your entire recovery and there's no point anymore. That means we learn from it and then we keep going. And as you keep going, the things that used to scare you, maybe on a 1 to 10 scale, used to be a 10. Now they are more like a 7. And then later on, they're more like a 5. And then they're a 3. And then eventually, they're a 0. So yes, recovery does come with a certain degree of anxiety. There is no way of doing recovery and never feeling afraid, never feeling uncomfortable and guilty and ashamed and all of these things. But even if you're someone where you feel like you have exceptionally low stress tolerance, you can actually still at least progress a little by adding on gradual goals. But it is that consistency that people struggle the most with. This is what I find over and over. And what I actually also find is that surprisingly often when I work with clients and we set goals, they find that the goals often go easier than expected and that the worst anxiety was before the challenge rather than when they actually were doing it. And that is something your brain needs to get the memo of. If your brain starts realizing, oh, the anxiety reaction I had beforehand to try and protect my person was actually a bit excessive. Okay, I can dial that down next time. And you may not notice it the next day, maybe not even the next week, sometimes even the next month. But give it enough time and you will start noticing that what was a 10 on the scale is suddenly 9, an 8, a 7, a 6, and it keeps going down. And why is that? Well, it's because of rewiring. It's because our brains are neuroplastic. And what that means is that they change, like our brains change. That's not a metaphor, by the way. They physically change. Like they say, neurons that fire together, wire together. So on a structure level, eating disorder recovery changes your brain. And I'm saying this because there will be a lot of people who be convinced that it's not possible for them because they've been sick for too long, they feel too afraid, they can't tolerate the stresses of recovery, but somehow everyone else is just so much braver than them, so much more resilient than them. Or they may have a co-occurring condition, they may have neurodivergence, and then think that that somehow makes them the exception to the rule rather than a very common variation of the rule. And this is not me dismissing the challenges of recovering when you have been sick for a longer period of time or when you have a brain that's just wired a bit differently. But you have to trust me as someone who kind of accidentally ended up specializing in long-term eating disorders. I'm talking 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years. And also working with neurodivergent clients, especially autistic clients. It adds challenges, but it doesn't inherently make it less possible for you to recover if you get support that supports your brain and acknowledges that certain things are going to be different if you've had an eating disorder for 50 years versus 5 years, or if you're autistic or allistic. Your brain is still neuroplastic. You are still capable of change. And even if you don't believe in full 100% recovery, why isn't even like a 50% improvement valuable? Why isn't even an 80%, 90% recovery valuable? I'm not saying full recovery isn't possible, by the way, but I'm saying even if it wasn't, why isn't shooting for better worthy? So let's talk a bit more about rewiring and more like the practicality around rewiring. biggest mistake I see people make, like I said, is not sticking to it. People may think that if they challenge themselves once, the fear should be gone. Or they may believe that if they do a challenge and it was difficult, then no hope. Your brain learned the fear through repeated action or inaction. So doing something once is not going to take away that fear. And the best, I guess, strategy of recovery is the one you can stick to. So rather than having one massive challenge once a month that completely overwhelms you and makes you freak out, try having something you can do consistently. I tend to encourage clients to try and shoot for at least one thing every day that you notice is really pushing your comfort zone. It's still something you can manage, but it makes you uncomfortable. And sometimes those challenges may feel unmanageable. You may have days where you freak out. That is not a sign of failure. It actually may be a sign of progress. Like I always say, things tend to scream when dying. So sometimes when you notice the most fear and resistance is actually a sign that you really pushed at something that needed to be pushed at. So there's one takeaway from this episode. It is repetition. Rewiring requires repetition. Another thing that is incredibly important is action. I mean, yeah, it sounds obvious when I say it, like you have to do the things. But a big issue I see that where people are really stuck is that they think that just knowing better is going to be enough. Knowing that they're not going to magically gain a ridiculous amount of weight overnight by having a specific food or by skipping their evening walk. And then instead of actually just doing or not doing the thing that scares them to do or not to do, they're doing everything else. So instead of skipping their evening walk, they go on a walk whilst listening to a podcast episode about why it's okay not to walk. Or they sit there with their safe food, being on Reddit on recovery forums, reading about all in and extreme hunger and having fear foods. Because they think, well, if I just get enough evidence, enough information, then my brain will stop being afraid and then I do the thing. No, that is not how it works. You make your brain less afraid by doing the thing, okay? You cannot sit around and just wait for the fear to go away. You have to do it with that level of discomfort. And don't get me wrong, of course it can be helpful to, to be in a recovery space. I mean, depending on the space, or listening to a podcast. I mean, a little bit biased here, but yeah, that can be a helpful thing. But it does not replace action. I would rather you never listen to my podcast ever again, but you were doing things that were challenging you in your recovery. And this is why I have so many people that come to me and they know everything about recovery. They could probably write a book about recovery, give someone else amazing advice, but they're completely stuck because they're waiting not to be afraid anymore. But that is just not going to work. You're going to wait forever. Of course, I understand that maybe hearing a certain podcast or reading an article can calm you down a bit in the moment and maybe even motivate you a bit, give you a bit of courage, but it doesn't replace action. The biggest indicator when I'm working with someone that they're going to do well in recovery is the work they're putting in, is the challenges they're completing, is that they're not avoiding the goals that we set. That's it. How long they've had an eating disorder or how motivated they are, how engaged they are in sessions, how much they know about recovery. These are not the biggest predictors. It is the ability to do the things they don't want to do, the things they are afraid of, and doing it consistently. Not just once when they had a good week and saw the light, but also the weeks and even sometimes months when you really don't want to do it. When you're demotivated, kind of bored with this whole recovery thing, you're kind of like, oh, should I cancel my session with my therapist or coach today? I don't feel like it. That is what makes or breaks recovery, that you follow through during those quote unquote like dry phases of recovery. And I know some people may listen to this and be like, oh yeah, that's where I struggle. Wait, great, recovery is just not for me then. No, not so fast. Hold on there. Yes, of course, it is true that you are going to have to be willing to do the things to recover. But also, I think it's worth sometimes working with resistance. So I actually find that a lot of times when someone is stuck, I almost think a bit like a scientist if I try to troubleshoot where this person is stuck. What are they afraid of? And sometimes by troubleshooting, we may figure out a point that you didn't even realize, where it's like, oh yeah, this is why I'm stuck. And that can maybe, in some cases, actually help you move forward. So I want to make that very clear. Feeling stuck does not disqualify you from recovery or mean that you don't deserve help. If anything, that's when you should see a therapist or a coach, because a therapist or a coach that knows their skill are going to help you figure out where you're stuck. And then once you know you're stuck, that's maybe more when you have to make a decision. Okay, do I stay stuck? Now I know a little bit why I'm stuck. Do I proceed forward from here or not? Or even if you find it hard to figure out where you're stuck, are you willing to be honest, not with just with yourself, but maybe with another person? Are you willing to try and explore? Are you willing to maybe admit things that are hard to admit? Admit fears that maybe you were embarrassed to have. I find a lot of times people come to me with a very polished version of their eating disorder. And then as we keep working, there is more honesty. Maybe admitting to certain behaviors that they felt ashamed admitting to. Maybe unpacking beliefs about their bodies, other people's bodies that they felt weren't too politically correct. And I'm just like, this is a safe space. I am not here to do some kind of moral purity test. Get it all out and we figure a way. And we can then figure out what is in alignment with your values versus what is more noise you've picked up from living in society. So yes, this is another important thing that maybe isn't spoken enough about: honesty. Not crafting a narrative about yourself, your identity, your eating disorder that may sound really good or inspiring or interesting on paper. Actually being honest about what's going on, being honest about your fears. And understand sometimes it can take some time being able to reach this more vulnerable stage, but it can be so transformative. So go where maybe you haven't wanted to go before, both in your brain and in terms of your behaviors. A metaphor that I like to use about rewiring that I, for some reason, can never explain in a good way, so try and bear with me here, is imagine you're in a forest with two paths. One path is really overgrown because that path just haven't been walked in a long time. So naturally it's grown over, and it's walking that path is going to be kind of inconvenient and a hassle because there's all like trees over it and it's like rocks and everything, overgrown path in the forest. And then there's another path, and that path has been walked so many times that it is smooth and easy, and it just, gets you to the destination pretty quick. You know that path. It's safe, it's familiar, and you're standing there, and one path is all overgrown, going to be a hassle to walk it, and it's unknown. You can't really even see where the path is taking you. And then the other path is all nice. You've walked so many times, you know exactly where it takes you. But you do know that that path, that really walked path, it's not taking you where you want to be. It's taking you somewhere, just not where you want to be. And rumor has it, this overgrown path that you can't really see where it's taking you, apparently it's going to take you somewhere really good. You heard the reviews of that destination is really solid. But walking that overgrown path is going to take a lot more hassle, especially in the beginning. Because now you're going to have to remove all of those leaves and rocks and wood that's fallen in the road. And it's going to be a bit of a hassle. And the first few times you start walking it, it's not going to be an automatic autopilot walk. Of course, the metaphor here is that the overgrown path is the recovery pathway of your brain. And the very smooth path that's been walked so many times, it's the eating disorder path. So when you're standing there, part of you knows that you need to take the recovery path. And if you start walking that recovery path, with time, that's going to be the easy to walk path. And if you keep ignoring the eating disorder pathway, then eventually that path is going to grow over. So with time, doing the eating disorder thing stops being automated, stops being just the easy breezy go-to. But it's going to take some time for that path to grow over and not be the go-to. And similarly, it's going to take some time for the overgrown path to be all nice and smooth. It requires quite a few people having walked there for a period of time before it becomes all smooth and easy. And every time you're choosing to walk the eating disorder path rather than the recovery path grows over a little bit more, becomes a little bit harder to walk it. And the eating disorder path becomes a little bit smoother to walk. And then every time you instead choose to walk the recovery path, then the recovery path becomes a bit smoother and the eating disorder path grows over more. Too many people think about how difficult or easy is the path in front of me to walk, rather than does this path take me to where I want and need to be? And let's face it, you know what's at the end of the eating disorder path. Yeah, I know your eating disorder may tell you, oh, this time will be different. This time, if you just keep walking the path, the destination will magically change. It will be different this time. Be lovely, great. BS, complete BS from the eating disorder. And the eating disorder is going to try and tell you that the recovery path is just the worst path. It's going to be impossible to walk. It doesn't matter how many times you walk that path, it's never going to get smoother, and the destination is going to suck. So why even try? But you've been down the eating disorder path. And again, the reviews of the recovery path are pretty good. Think about it, people who recovered from their eating disorder. Do they typically say, wow, worst decision of my life, absolutely hated it? Is that the general consensus of recovered people? And then think of people who've been living with an eating disorder. Do they typically say, yeah, 10 out of 10 experience, can totally recommend it, never want to let it go? No. So think about where you want to be and what path you need to take to get there. And the more you follow that path, the easier it gets. And planning walking the path, looking up the map nonstop, checking the weather forecast, talking to everyone who's walked the path. At some point, you're going to have to walk the path. You can't just postpone it or taking one step and be like, oh, this was hard, I'm going back. Yeah, it's going to be hard until it's easy. Everything is hard until it's easy. And I think this is something a lot of people get wrong. They think because they have, for example, in recovery, intense fears, intense urges to engage in behaviors, that recovery means having that degree of intensity or urges forever, but just learning to suppress it and not do it. That is not true. That's a bad deal. Honestly, if for the rest of my life I had to resist intense urges to engage in eating disorder behaviors and feel perpetually terrified of food, I don't think I would have stayed recovered. It does get easier. And I really dislike some of the narratives floating around where it's like, oh, you never actually get better. You just learn to live with it. Like, no, what? No, that's not true. It actually does get easier. You do experience a decrease in the urges, in the fears. And if not, maybe you're limiting yourself a bit. Maybe you should, switch gears a bit. Maybe see a different provider, something like that. Like, it absolutely is possible and realistic to feel less afraid and to feel less urges. Heck, maybe even liking yourself more. I know, crazy idea, but I'm just saying. But you have to understand that the magic is in the work you're avoiding. I say this all the time. You cannot think yourself into recovery. You have to do. And it's better to do than think. Your brain is kind of going to go for the path of less resistance and make you think that if you're just thinking about the problem a lot, you're doing something. But actually thinking less and doing more is going to get you a lot further. Thinking can become a trap. I see so many people that struggle with rumination, sometimes as more of like a safety behavior to manage anxiety. And it actually is something you have to work on not doing. Yeah, I know, controversial, but you can actually learn to think less. So this was part 1 of a series I'm doing on rewiring. And then the next episode, I'm going to talk about sneaky behaviors and habits and about safety behaviors. So essentially, I'm going to talk about how a lot of times people really forget focusing on those sneaky little things that keep their eating disorder going because they think it's harmless. They think that it doesn't really matter as long as I focus on the big things. As long as I'm not excessively over-exercising, going for a sneaky little walk to alleviate my anxiety about what I ate, that shouldn't be an issue. Or as long as I'm maintaining a healthy weight, then who cares if I'm checking the nutritional label of everything I'm eating? Who cares? What's the problem? Or as long as I'm doing food challenges, why does it matter that I'm all weird around the oil when I'm cooking something? So as I will talk about in that episode, those are the things that keep your eating disorder going. Those are the things when someone is like, why am I still stuck? I'm doing everything right, where there often is a lot of work to be done. And I'm also going to talk about safety behaviors. So I kind of briefly mention a little bit around that, but it is little things you're doing in an attempt to alleviate your anxiety that actually ends up making your anxiety worse. I'm going to talk a bit about how this all becomes a habit, something you do oftentimes without fully consciously realizing it, and some strategies to help it as well. I hope you enjoyed this episode on rewiring, a little bit about what's behind it, what drives it, and why it's so important to do opposite actions. Repeat, repeat. If you enjoyed this episode, share it maybe with someone who needs to hear it. And make sure you follow the podcast as well so you get notified when new episodes are out. I'm shooting for every 2 weeks, give or take. You can follow me on Instagram at Amalie Lee or at letsrecover.co.uk. And for coaching related inquiries, head over to letsrecover.co.uk. Take care. See you guys in the next episode.